Once upon a time, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was a kingdom in Hollywood. But with enough time, even the greatest kingdom can fall. In the history of film, few companies are as instantly recognizable as Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Studios, better known as MGM. It isn't just because of that iconic lion roar logo, but because of how long they've been around and just how many classic films have been made by them. Name just a few and you can immediately understand how the building blocks of Hollywood are permanently tied to MGM. The Wizard of Oz, James Bond, Ben-Hur, Gone with the Wind, Rocky, Singin' in the Rain. Those are just a few of the thousands of movies produced by MGM in the more than century of movie making since the studio was founded in 1924. If you're anything like me, and I know I am, then by merely loving film, you're already somewhat familiar with MGM. Or maybe it's the MGM Grand Hotel in Vegas that makes you familiar with the brand. Or in recent years, it's the Amazon-MGM merger and the chaotic battle over the fate of the James Bond franchise that has put MGM in your mind. All of these continue to make MGM at least somewhat relevant to people. But when was the last time that MGM actually made a great movie that was successful and captured the general audience's imagination? Today, MGM is merely a shell of its past self, a logo and a film library coveted by today's most powerful conglomerations that have pulled apart the dying carcass of a once great movie house. So the question is, what made MGM so special in the first place that it essentially became the studio that created the golden age of Hollywood? And what led to its brutal, slow downfall over the course of decades? The answer lies in a million little choices that all add up to disaster. This is the century-long fall of MGM. How an all-time great Hollywood studio was sold for scraps. The story of MGM essentially begins with the invention of the moving picture itself. It was all the way back in 1896 when motion pictures were first screened in New York. And at first these were just novelty inventions, showing the same moving image over and over, and eventually spread through Nickelodeons across the United States and then around the world as these began to tell actual stories. And once audiences were hooked, they wanted full-fledged stories, with movies like The Great Train Robbery and A Trip to the Moon cracking open how to tell a narrative through silent film. One of the first people to capitalize on the growing popularity of film was Marcus Loew, owning penny arcades and 5-cent Nickelodeons, and then building New York City's then largest theater, Loew's National, combining live vaudeville acts with motion pictures. And soon, with early monopolies that sought to control the film industry defeated, and studios traveling to California for new opportunities, many different film studios began to pop up. Among these were Metro Pictures Corporation, formed by a group of distributors and smaller companies and shepherded to success by producer Louis B. Mayer, and the 1915 distribution of one of the all-time works of racism, The Birth of a Nation. By 1919, Metro was struggling and was soon bought by Marcus Loew for $3 million. However, Loew's ambition to make 50 to 75 films a year, which would feed his theaters an endless stream of hits, was simply untenable. That shortcoming was soon counterbalanced in January of 1924 when Goldwyn Pictures and its then president Joseph Godsell offered to be sold to Loew. The addition of Goldwyn Pictures brought a huge stable of stars, soon-to-be hits like the original Ben-Hur still in production, new studio grounds, major capital, strong distribution deals, and the roaring lion logo with the phrase Ars Gratia Artis, arts for art's sake, that would come to be known as MGM's signature. And on April 14, 1924, Metro and Goldwyn were officially merged through a $5 million stock swap. To run the suddenly massive organization, Loew brought on Louis B. Mayer, who had left Metro before its purchase, buying out Louis B. Mayer Productions for $75,000 and making Mayer vice president, general manager, and giving a special credit to Mayer on any film produced at the studio. Alongside Mayer was vice president in charge of production Irving Thalberg, who also worked at Mayer Productions before the buyout. Only 24 years old at the time, and a new name for the merged studio, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, or MGM for short, officially launching on April 26, 1924, and setting up shop in Culver City, California. Mayer was under pressure to make 15 films in his first year alone, but Lowe's ambition for quantity was more than matched by Mayer's ambition for quality, with the vice president saying, "My unchanging policy will be great star, great director, great play, great cast. Spare nothing, neither expense, time, nor effort. Results only are what I am after." In its first several years, MGM found highs and lows in the world of silent film, with their first picture, the Lon Chaney starring He Who Gets Slapped, a big success, while Erich von Stroheim's massive Greed, shot for Goldwyn before the merger, was majorly tampered with by Thalberg, who cut it down from 4 hours to 2, and it failed at the box office. On the other hand, Ben-Hur, another massive production inherited from Goldwyn, was a smash hit in 1925. As a result, MGM earned a profit of $4.7 million in its first year of existence, becoming the second most profitable movie studio behind the well-established Paramount. In its first decade, you can see MGM carve out a tried-and-true game plan. Mayer and Thalberg were fully in control of the budgets and directors that brought their films to life, ruling out creators that didn't want to fit into their system and bringing on established stars to anchor the various genre films they cranked out year after year. With Greta Garbo, Lon Chaney, John Gilbert, Buster Keaton, Joan Crawford, Clark Gable, and more becoming fixtures of MGM. All the while, the studio was cranking out more than 50 movies a year in the 20s, with Lowe retiring as head of MGM after a heart attack, and officially replaced by Nicholas Schenck in 1928 as the president of Lowe's Incorporated, the parent company of MGM. And as sound came to motion pictures alongside the widespread usage of radio, MGM moved into both, with the studio founding its own radio station, WMGM. However, they were slower to adopt sound and film than their competitors, with Irving Thalberg saying in response to the debut of the first talkie, The Jazz Singer in 1927, "Novelty is always welcome, but talking pictures are just a fad." However, the fast adoption of sound by other studios and the tangible proof of business being lost at Lowe's theaters pushed MGM into sound with their first talkie, The Broadway Melody, debuting on February 1st, 1929. The transition to sound and film was a terrifying and unpredictable transition across Hollywood. Some silent actors transitioned well, others were driven out of their careers, and many new stars were made in the aftermath. And for MGM, the appeal of the talkies brought even greater success, with the studio making a record $15 million profit in 1930, its best year until 1946, having to trudge through the Great Depression and World War II before truly flourishing once again. Still, despite the hardships at home and abroad, the 1930s brought some of MGM's most famous and influential films that are still closely identified with the studio. Freaks and the Best Picture winning Grand Hotel in 1932, The Thin Man in 1934 and many sequels that followed, Mutiny on the Bounty and A Night at the Opera in 1935, The Great Ziegfeld in 1936, Goodbye Mr. Chips, The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind in 1939, The Philadelphia Story in 1940, and Meet Me in St. Louis in 1944. Obviously, with MGM making dozens of pictures every year, there are plenty of forgotten and forgettable films, but the studio managed to stick through an era when audiences were poor, war was spreading, and the future was uncertain thanks to big hits and long-running series like The Thin Man, Tarzan, and Dr. Kildare. It was throughout these years that Thalberg proved his worth to the studio, and he put a high priority on screenwriters, and made sure that they approved of the actors cast that would bring their scripts to life. He was also deeply involved in the story process of every movie that he produced, often hiring multiple screenwriters at a time to churn out new drafts for movies to align with MGM's assembly line-like approach. Grand Hotel in 1932 is really the solidification of the early MGM style, and one that stood in stark contrast to the growing Great Depression of the time. A massive cast of stars, a dazzling technical display, and an escapism that was severely needed by audiences. Today, it's seen as one of the most forgettable films to have won the Academy Award for Best Picture, but at the time, its razzle-dazzle separated it from most other films. Behind the scenes, tensions were growing between the major players at MGM. Louis B. Mayer in particular hated Nick Schenck, who tried to shortchange creatives and executives as often as possible. Schenck despised Mayer and looked for any way to get him out of the company. Mayer also grew to resent Thalberg, as it was Thalberg who was given credit for much of the creativity at MGM, while Mayer was the hard-nosed businessman. Meanwhile, Irving Thalberg, suffering from frequent bouts of depression and financial strain, nearly jumped ship until he was given the option to buy up 100,000 shares of Lowe's stock at MGM for cheap, giving him a financial control that backed up his already impressive creative control. However, at the end of 1932, Thalberg suffered a heart attack, stepping back from many of his duties and resulting in Mayer consolidating power behind the scenes, eager to be the ruler of MGM. In his place was David O. Selznick, who had made his name as production chief at rival studio RKO and was Louis B. Mayer's son-in-law. And while Selznick's time at MGM only lasted from 1933 through 1935, he produced a string of major hits for less money, including Dinner at 8, 1933, David Copperfield, 1935, Anna Karenina, 1935, and A Tale of Two Cities, also 1935. In fact, when Thalberg returned, he and O. Selznick were given separate production studios within MGM, creating a somewhat friendly rivalry between the two to see who could be more successful within the studio, while also preventing Thalberg from having general control at the company. Clearly, the many existing parts, approaches, and rivalries that were brought together through the MGM merger were as strong and independent as ever, pushing and pulling the conglomeration in different directions as MGM worked harder than ever to stay profitable during the Depression. But Irving Thalberg would never see the end of the era, passing away on September 14, 1936 at the age of 37 from pneumonia, the result of long-running heart issues since birth. There would never be another executive at MGM that produced such a high volume of films or was as deeply involved in productions on a day-to-day level as Thalberg. But despite struggling to find a true replacement, MGM would soon find its highest level of success ever in its century of existence. Outside of the rise and fall of producers at MGM, one of the aspects of the golden age of Hollywood that I've always been fascinated with is the widespread usage of actor contracts that came to define the old Hollywood system. These contracts locked actors into exclusive deals with a single studio for multiple years at a time, and it also forbade them from working with any other studio as long as they were on contract, and essentially forced them to make whatever the studio wanted them to work on. It's a stark contrast to the often individual film-by-film auditioning and deals that became normal after the breaking of old Hollywood in the 60s, and it meant that while these contracts gave actors a guaranteed steady income, they would be forced into films they hated, with some producers choosing to punish unruly actors by putting them in roles they knew they wouldn't like. In 1934, MGM chose to punish star Clark Gable over his demands for better pay by loaning him out to rival Columbia for a film he didn't want to make. That movie? Frank Capra's It Happened One Night. One of my favorite films, and the first movie to ever win the Big Five Academy Awards, including Best Actor for Gable, and making the actor a bigger star with greater clout at the studio than ever. In 1935, MGM was legally absorbed into their parent company, Loews Incorporated, making them into a single entity and sharing the combined profits of movie studio and theater chain for massive paydays that hit a record high of $14.3 million in 1937, with executives getting massive bonuses, including $1.3 million alone to Mayer one year. And alongside the pay, Louis B. Mayer was now the uncontested ruler of MGM, given his own massive air-conditioned office in the newly christened Thalberg Building, named after the man whose death gave him control. And as the head of MGM, Mayer was known as a living contradiction, genial and kind, taking on a fatherly stance with his employees and stars, but also notoriously cheap, fighting any and all requests for a raise from those he positioned himself as a father to. A man who loved to share meals with the common man, but who also had a private suite known as the Lion's Den, for secret meetings with executives and his cronies to consolidate power. Mayer preached love, traditional family values, and wanted MGM's films to be broadly appealing, exciting stories that reflected wholesome American ideals that excluded sex and controversy, helping MGM easily work around the Hays Code of the time. But Mayer and MGM all but officially controlled Culver City. Its police, lawyers, hospitals, and infrastructure all answered to MGM. Car crashes were swept under the rug, affair rumors were squashed before they could reach the tabloids, and all manner of drug deals, assaults, rapes, and other illegal activities were pushed out of court before victims could find justice. Of course, it wasn't Mayer who would get his hands dirty with such deals, but MGM's number one fixer, Eddie Mannix, who would bully, bribe, extort, and assault to keep the studio's stars clean and their victims brushed under the rug. On the movie-making side, Mayer was all in favor of turning hit films into a series, spacing out sequels by a couple years, but keeping new entries in a franchise rolling. If a movie was a hit with a simple formula, MGM would roll out sequel after sequel. The MGM head was also a big fan of musicals, taking the studio's reputation for creating massive epics full of expensive craft and glamour, and shifting them towards song and dance. This was all made possible by Arthur Freed, who was given his own unit within the studio and kept the musicals rolling for more than 2 decades, at times responsible for a quarter of all of MGM's films each year. It was The Wizard of Oz in 1939 that proved the potential of the MGM musical, made for a then massive budget of $2.5 million, and a disastrous production that saw a non-stop parade of directors being hired and fired, and multiple injuries on set. Oz was the crown jewel of MGM when it premiered, of course, at Loew's Capitol Theater on Broadway. But because of its massive production cost, it didn't turn a profit until a decade later thanks to re-releases and constant TV airings. Over time, Oz and MGM would become synonymous, and the film's undying popularity would go on to dictate the fate of the studio. But more on that later. Strangely, MGM's biggest film of 1939, and one of the biggest movies of all time, had almost nothing at all to do with MGM. Gone with the Wind was the product of producer David O. Selznick, who by this time had already left MGM to make his own independent studio. It was Selznick who bought the rights to Margaret Mitchell's book after MGM and several other studios had turned it down. But Selznick needed 2 things from MGM: their production team to bring the massive film to life, and their contracted star actor Clark Gable, who Selznick saw as the only man who could bring the character of Rhett Butler to life. In return, MGM got half of the film's profits after already deducting 15 cents from every dollar of its income. It was an insane deal struck by Mayer when Selznick had painted himself into a corner, and upon release, Gone with the Wind almost immediately became the biggest film of all time, making $13.5 million in its first year. An insane number at the time that nearly equaled the profits of 7 other Hollywood studios combined that year. It also won 8 Academy Awards alongside 2 wins for The Wizard of Oz and 1 for Goodbye Mr. Chips. Altogether, 1939 is MGM's greatest year in its century of existence, and the profits made in 1 year alone helped carry it along through the first half of the 1940s as World War II raged on across Europe, essentially closing it to any and all film distribution, with the United States' entry into the war making finances stateside tighter than ever. Like most other studios, MGM made its share of wartime propaganda films, losing many of their major stars as they joined the war effort. At its height, MGM's studio lot was incredible. Built on 40 acres in Culver City, California, owned by Samuel Goldwyn, the studio property was 3 miles long, had 45 buildings with 14 stages, and continued to build more and more outdoor sets to accommodate the ever-growing scale and scope of its massive movies. The 1940s brought several big stars and changes to MGM. At the forefront was Katharine Hepburn. Previously labeled as box office poison in her early years at RKO, Hepburn shrewdly worked to overhaul her screen presence by buying out her RKO contract, finding success on Broadway with The Philadelphia Story, and then taking the play to MGM for a star revamping vehicle for her alongside Cary Grant and Jimmy Stewart. Behind the scenes, MGM had ballooned up to 40 producers to handle the variety of shoots happening at any given time, taking on increasingly complex projects that were once handled by only Thalberg and Selznick. Meanwhile, stars like Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney became the non-stop leads of any and all musicals produced by MGM, like Babes on Broadway, Meet Me in St. Louis, and Ziegfeld Girl. Garland and Rooney were the squeaky clean young stars on screen, but battled their demons off of it, essentially losing their childhoods to the movie business and even being educated on the studio lot with MGM's own schoolhouse. Rooney struggled with drugs, alcohol, and sex scandals, but Garland suffered the most. Introduced to pep pills for long hours of work and sleeping pills to come down hard by her abusive mother, Garland also accused MGM of pushing her into further drug use to lose weight whenever they wanted. MGM had us working days and nights on end, said Garland. They'd give us pep pills to keep us on our feet long after we were exhausted. Then they'd take us to the studio hospital and knock us cold with sleeping pills. Then after 4 hours, they'd wake us up and give us the pep pills again so we could work another 72 hours in a row. I started to feel like a wind-up toy from FAO Schwartz. Garland is maybe the definitive example of the dark side of Hollywood during the Golden Age, and is the counterbalance to all the glitz and glamour we come to think of when we talk about MGM. And once the studio had moved past World War II and the Great Depression, and was done with propaganda films and limited budgets, the big budget, lavish musical continued to expand at the studio, with Frank Sinatra, Gene Kelly, Fred Astaire, Donald O'Connor, and more becoming the new major stars of this period of MGM. If there was one word to describe the MGM films of the 1940s, it was expensive. The studio had continued to grow its reputation on lavish musicals, massive productions, and films that were designed to wow audiences, and there were truly no shortcuts. Movies like The Yearling, a deer-centered family drama that was postponed for 3 years as the crew kept growing corn and trying to breed fawns, it wasn't worth it, were more the rule than the exception at the studio during the decade. Meanwhile, the stars that MGM had relied on for years were growing older and less exciting to the public, with people like Spencer Tracy, Katharine Hepburn, and Clark Gable still anchoring their biggest pictures but drawing smaller crowds. And despite America booming post-war, 1948 was MGM's least profitable year in 2 decades with only $4.2 million. A combination of multiple box office misfires and studio spending growing out of control. In response, MGM hired Dory Sherry as production head, lifting him out of RKO after the studio was purchased by germaphobe millionaire Howard Hughes, much to Sherry's dismay. And Sherry immediately went to work bringing the studio's spending under control and bringing his passion project to life, Battleground, which was nominated for Best Picture. The new production head had successfully pulled the studio out of a nosedive, bouncing back profits by 1949 and doubling its yearly film output with greater variety. However, disputes over profits, company share options given to executives of their choosing, and decades of strife caused Mayer and Skink to be more at odds than ever, with Skink favoring the new tactics of Sherry over Mayer's old ways. With the executives at an impasse and Mayer publicly voicing his displeasure to the New York Times, Mayer gave Skink an ultimatum. It's either Sherry or me. And that was all the president needed to hear. On June 22, 1951, Louis B. Mayer resigned from MGM, the studio that partially bore his name and was ruled by him for 27 years. And while Mayer would attempt a few different ventures at other companies, including a failed takeover at MGM, the MGM co-founder would eventually pass away on October 29, 1957, at the age of 73 from leukemia. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer would never be the same. Despite Mayer being gone, his influence remained in the years following his resignation. An American in Paris bore the hallmarks of Mayer's focus on big-budget musicals and had just been put into production when he left, only to go on to win Best Picture in 1952. However, the 1950s brought massive change to MGM due to several huge trend changes across entertainment. In order to keep up with the international market, MGM opened up several new headquarters around the world, which meant it needed to cut staff and budget at its Hollywood home. Meanwhile, 7-year actor contracts finally went out of style in favor of individual film contracts with profit-sharing percentages. At the same time, TV finally hit its boom period, with 10 million TV sets sold in 1951 alone, and only growing from there. This would force MGM to move past the classic era of Hollywood filmmaking, and would also force the closure of many, many Loews theaters. It was time for MGM to move on. However, Sherry and Skink were in full public denial, clinging to the old approach to film and insisting ticket sales were as great as ever, when in reality they had dropped by 20%. Instead of licensing out their film library to air on TV or to open up their own TV production division, MGM leaned on 3D, CinemaScope, and other technology to make movies exciting again. Arthur Freed's musical division made their films grander than ever. Singin' in the Rain is incredible and was a success, but was also hugely expensive. It wasn't until The Wizard of Oz first aired on CBS on November 3, 1956, to massive ratings as part of a $1.7 million deal, that MGM was finally shaken awake to the power of television. Soon after, the studio created a package of 700 films for stations to air for $25 million, showcasing just how massive MGM's library already was, and how TV could bring relevance back to the studio. Behind the scenes, the continued turmoil of trying to stay relevant caused chaos at MGM, as Skink was soon pushed out of his role as president by Arthur M. Lowe, son of founder Marcus Lowe, who was then replaced by longtime manager Joseph R. Vogel, who then pushed Sherry out of his role, blaming him for the company's woes. The new focus? The youths. 1955's The Blackboard Jungle, 1958's Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, and a string of Elvis Presley hits starting with 1957's Jailhouse Rock all placed younger actors, rock and roll, and sex at the forefront of their stories, while 1958's Gigi was essentially the last of MGM's classic musicals, bringing an end to the long-standing collaboration between producer Arthur Freed and director Vincent Minnelli. Meanwhile, the massive Ben-Hur in 1959, which saw the studio work to top their original version, was the last gasp of the MGM epic. And the 1960s weren't just rough for MGM, they were the decade that brought an end to the studio as it was. There weren't just fewer films made every year, there were fewer hits and fewer awards nominations. The movie studio system was passing MGM by as they continued to shuffle executives in and out in search of something that would finally work for the studio once again. Falling stocks, board battles, and fights between shareholders left MGM vulnerable to a takeover by millionaire Kirk Kerkorian, the one man who would forever break apart an empire. The son of Armenian immigrants, Kirk Kerkorian had worked as a handyman at MGM in his youth and then a pilot before making his fortune in airlines and Las Vegas hotels, parlaying his wealth into becoming the majority shareholder of the studio in 1969 and holding its fate in his hands. Without a history in filmmaking, Kerkorian chose James T. Aubrey to run MGM. Aubrey, whose very telling nickname was the Smiling Cobra, was a former president of CBS and known as a ruthless womanizer. Really, Kerkorian was so disengaged with the day-to-day movie business of MGM that the offices had a code whenever he was actually around. The ghost is in the building. Now, there's no doubt that MGM was a disaster by the time Kerkorian took over and was in need of a major overhaul. But what came next is nuts. Aubrey's first course of action to make MGM profitable again? Sell everything. In 1970 alone, Aubrey fired half of MGM's staff, totaling about 3,500 terminated employees, canceled 12 in-progress films, closed the London studios, which were very successful in the 60s, sold all overseas theaters, sold the Culver City backlots to developers, sold thousands of props, costumes, and memorabilia collected from half a century of filmmaking in what was essentially a rummage sale, sold MGM's music publishing companies, and broke ground on what was then the world's largest hotel, the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. The buck had to stop somewhere, and it was with me, said Aubrey. Nostalgia runs strong out here, so we were criticized for selling Judy Garland's red shoes. To us, they had no value. As for the MGM Grand, for decades it existed as maybe the most public-facing front for a studio that had quickly faded out of the limelight. It's probably the way I even first heard of MGM myself, visiting a great-grandmother in Vegas and getting a glimpse of the studio's mythic past with exhibits showcasing The Wizard of Oz and other classic films from the catalog. But the hotel that stands today is actually the second MGM Grand built in Vegas. The first Grand suffered one of the worst high-rise fires in US history on November 21st, 1980, with 85 people dying in the blaze. While the hotel was reopened a year later, and the incident caused new fire safety codes around the world, it and the Grand in Reno were purchased and renamed by Bally's in 1986. A new MGM Grand was opened on the Vegas Strip in 1993. Once again, the largest hotel in the world, and honestly, sporting an awesome exterior that I still think looks great today. And while the new Grand has gone through ups and downs, it's remained one of the more popular Vegas resorts, shifting with the times and Vegas's perception. However, even the MGM Grand is barely associated with MGM Studios these days. At first owned by MGM Resorts International, owned by Kerkorian, before they and MGM Growth Properties were purchased by Vici Properties. That's a complex tangent to say that as a result of Krikorian's continued sell-off and hotel focus, even a public-facing hotel like the MGM Grand isn't really even MGM as a whole, and it's indicative of everything that was to come for the studio. Anyway, back to the continued destruction of MGM in 1970. In barely a year, Krikorian and Aubrey had sold off most of MGM for scraps in the name of making as much fast money as possible and turning the once grand studio into a hotel and airline brand. And MGM never truly recovered. So with the company essentially stripped of most of its movie-making ability, the 70s were a terrible time for MGM. The studio could only produce around 5 mid-sized budget films each year, relying on co-productions and distributing other studios' films to keep their presence on the big screen. There are a few notable MGM films from the 70s, Shaft, Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, Westworld, and Network being the notable ones among a small field. Meanwhile, MGM executives passed up on a variety of films that would go on to make millions for other studios. Jaws, Dirty Dancing, and Terms of Endearment being just a few. And so with little actually being made in the decade thanks to Krikorian, that brings us all the way up to 1981, when Krikorian purchased another once highly esteemed studio, United Artists. The sad story of UA is a topic that will need its own video someday, but what's important to know is that United Artists, founded in 1919 by Charlie Chaplin, D.W. Griffith, Mary Pickford, and Douglas Fairbanks as a home dedicated to independent artistic visions, had slowly weakened over the decades until the disastrous box office bomb Heaven's Gate, yet another video topic for another time, essentially gave it the finishing blow. And so, with the studio on its last legs, Krikorian purchased United Artists for $380 million, said by many to be way too much, and merged it to form MGM UA. For their part, UA brought another 900 movies into the MGM library, including the James Bond and Rocky properties, and made the ever-growing catalog into a truly astonishing collection as Alan Ladd Jr. was brought in as president and chief operating officer of MGM UA. Seems like MGM's fortunes were finally turning around, right? Wrong. This is where things get even worse. Turns out MGM was still in major debt, and so Krikorian, always focused on fast money, sold the combined studio to media tycoon Ted Turner, a figure who often shows up in the history of any studio that lived through the 80s and 90s, for $1.5 billion and assumption of the company's $500 million debt in 1986. Except that Turner didn't want all that, so Krikorian bought back UA alone for $480 million. Sunk cost fallacy is a real thing, people. As well as, of all things, the MGM logo for another $300 million. After that, Turner turned around and sold the remnants of the MGM lot in Culver City to Lorimar Telepictures and the production assets and trademarks of MGM back to United Artists. It's an insane series of purchases and sales that seem to make no sense at all, until you see what Turner was left with: the rights to the entire MGM film library. How can you go broke buying the Rembrandts of the programming business when you are a programmer, said Turner. Now owning more than 2,000 MGM films, Turner Entertainment Company added the pre-1950s Warner Brothers film library and the entirety of the RKO library, using these exclusive rights to power the programming of Turner's many different cable stations. It was a smart move for Turner, giving his conglomeration some of the most highly praised films in history to become an attraction alongside a still growing assortment of homemade shows. But amidst all those sales, shifts, and new owners, you may have forgotten one little thing: Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Studios, now cut off from its own backlog of history, but alive and back under the one man who wanted nothing to do with it: Kirk Kerkorian. The 1980s really illustrate just how far MGM had fallen. This is a decade that produced massive hits, blockbusters, new box office records, and an endless stream of cult classics that are still beloved today. As for MGM, they barely made anything of relevance during the decade. Once you take away films that the studio only distributed, you're left with less than 10 a year, and among those, the standouts are only Fame in 1980, Clash of the Titans in 1981, Rocky III and Poltergeist in 1982, and Spaceballs and Moonstruck in 1987. It really illustrates how far MGM had fallen when you realize that United Artists produced way more films during that decade, becoming the production side of the merged company, including the James Bond films made during the decade, while MGM only had the infrastructure to distribute. So it shouldn't come as a surprise when in 1990, Krikorian once again sold MGM for $1.3 billion to European film company Pathé Communications, although Krikorian retained limited rights to the name and logo for the sake of his hotel and airline, MGM Grand Air, which was formed in 1987 and then sold in 1995, changing its name to Champion Air. And so that brings us to yet another iteration, MGM Pathé Communications, which lasted from the end of 1990 to the end of 1996. Unfortunately, this might be the most bullshit of all of MGM's iterations. Pathé Communications is not the French studio Pathé SAS. It's actually the remnant of failed but entertaining dumpster fire Cannon Films, purchased by Italian financier Giancarlo Peretti at the same time as MGM to form the new conglomeration. But soon after the purchase, it was discovered that Peretti was a fraud, financing the merger through a series of fraudulent loans, with the new owner firing most of MGM's remaining staff after the takeover, trying to sell the TV rights to the James Bond franchise without consulting the Broccoli family, which resulted in a lengthy legal battle that basically timed out Timothy Dalton's time as Bond, and bouncing multiple checks to high-profile stars. MGM Pathé had fallen apart so quickly and definitively that French bank Crédit Lyonnais took over the nearly bankrupt studio, ousted Peretti, and let the newly renamed Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, nice and clean, limp on for the next few years before being put up for sale. Interested buyers included the Walt Disney Company, General Electric, and Polygram, but ultimately MGM was bought in October of 1996 by, seriously? Krikorian. Unsurprisingly for the rest of the 1990s, MGM existed as essentially only a distribution wing for other studios, with Krikorian more interested in snapping up other film libraries, acquiring the back catalogs of Metromedia and Polygram to pump up a library that essentially had to start from scratch in 1986, while finding success on TV with their never-ending Stargate shows. Still, it seems like Krikorian lost interest once again as MGM was sold to Sony Pictures in 2004 for nearly $5 billion after a bidding war with Time Warner, forming MGM Holdings Inc. as its own holding company. But there was one bright shining moment when, my god, MGM was actually making movies again. That lasted until 2005, when MGM proudly stuck its tail between its legs and announced it was going back to being a distribution company only. This also led to Tom Cruise and his production partner Paula Wagner buying a 30% stake in United Artists in 2006 to gain control of their own production department. See, this is that period of time when Cruise was trying to be an artistic, auteur-led creator before he fully pushed into action hero madness. Their reign didn't last long, with the Cruise UA making Lions for Lambs and Valkyrie before giving up and allowing MGM to reacquire 100% of UA by 2011. Permanently linking their offices and film libraries. See, here's the thing about MGM in the 2000s. Despite all the different deals it made regarding its partners and where its films were shown, the studio was just a shell of its former self, trading on clout gained from decades of experience and relevance, and on films that it actually no longer had any rights to. This all led to MGM finally filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on November 3rd, 2010, due to being $4 billion in debt. In order to get out of that debt and get out of bankruptcy, debt was exchanged for company control of MGM. And while this did lead to a higher degree of films being put out during the 2010s, what's clear is that the once mighty studio that helped shape what it meant to be a Hollywood film was now little more than a holding company, trading off of its old films and prestige. Hot Tub Time Machine, 21 Jump Street, Skyfall, The Hobbit Trilogy, Spectre, Creed, Tomb Raider, Little Women, and more were all part of MGM fully coming back as a film production company in the 2010s and early 2020s. The result of the post-bankruptcy restructuring putting new heads in charge that wanted to return the studio to prominence. The thing is, MGM was no longer owned and run by people with a passion for filmmaking. Instead, it really just came down to numbers for the company's new creditor owners. And when the COVID-19 pandemic indefinitely closed movie theaters and threw the future of film up in the air, MGM's owners put it up for sale. The new and current owner, Amazon, who purchased the studio for $8.5 billion and merged their studios to officially form Amazon MGM Studios on March 17, 2022. And in the few years since, the new version of the studio has produced a consistent string of films with only a few standouts. The combination of Challengers, Beekeeper, Roadhouse, The Accountant 2, After the Hunt, and Blink Twice show that the new Amazon MGM Studios is searching for some critical praise and a willingness to work with strong artistic voices, but also has a need for some commercial relevance. Still, the vision isn't clear, and that's probably due to the studio having no official head now. Only several executives that now report to Mike Hopkins, the head of Prime Video. Still, at the time of this video's creation, upcoming films like Project Hail Mary, Masters of the Universe, and a new Thomas Crown Affair could be huge studio-defining hits if they work right. So, where does MGM sit today? Well, there's really three MGMs that have little to do with one another. One, the MGM of old, the classic studio that made The Wizard of Oz, Gone with the Wind, and more. While Ted Turner and Turner Broadcasting purchased the catalog in 1986, they were soon acquired by Time Warner in 1996, which means that all classic MGM movies made before 1986 are now part of Warner Brothers. 2. MGM the Hotel. Long held by Kirk Kerkorian, the MGM Grand and everything related to it was lost by Kerkorian in 2009 and is now owned by Vici Properties. And 3. The new MGM. The actual existing studio that went through numerous owners after 1986 is now fully owned by Amazon, giving them the rights to everything made post-1986, as well as the entire James Bond franchise, with a distribution deal split between streaming on Amazon Prime and released theatrically through United Artists, now existing as its own small company within Amazon. It's a messy, convoluted state of existence that, instead of being caused by one or two bad decisions, is the result of many, many small bad ones, greedy owners, and a very unclear state of direction for a studio over the course of 50 years, which squandered the goodwill, prestige, and wonderful output of the first half century of one of Hollywood's early defining studios. In some ways, it's a testament to just how amazing Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was in its golden age. It doesn't matter how old you are. Once Leo the Lion roars, you're immediately transported back to a time when classic Hollywood filmmaking made anything seem possible on film. You remember the musicals, the magic, the romance, and forget all the terrible movies, shady deals, broken dreams, and backstabbing politics that brought it all down. If the story of MGM reminds me of anything, it's the 1818 poem Ozymandias by Percy Bysshe Shelley, which details a crumbling statue found in an ancient land. Once a tribute to a vast kingdom, now nothing remains but the broken statue and its inscription. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains, round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Once upon a time, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was a kingdom in Hollywood. But with enough time, even the greatest kingdom can fall. And there's nothing that can bring back together what was broken. Thanks for watching today's video, and I'm back doing another history of a fallen Hollywood studio. If you're familiar at all with my channel before this, you may have seen some of my past videos on the histories of studios, like New Line Cinema, Don Bluth Studios, DreamWorks, or my coverage of the Disney Renaissance. And in my last video covering New Line, I ran into MGM during their history and said in the video that I would eventually talk about MGM, and its very long and messy history. Usually I do about one of these a year, but I was really itching to get back to something like this, because I find it to be a really interesting challenge for me to make, and it's really enjoyable and fun, and people seem to really enjoy it too. And the history of MGM is unlike the history of any other studio that I've covered so far, because it's very long, very convoluted, has a lot of different powerful figures come in and out, has a lot of ups and downs, some amazing movies, and a lot of bad movies and bad decisions. Put all together in one video, and you can see how it all adds up to a studio eventually falling apart, and being broken in such a way that it can really never be put back together. Obviously, everyone associates MGM with something like The Wizard of Oz, and with good reason, as well as something like Singing in the Rain or Gone with the Wind, but it's interesting to see where the studio went after that early heyday, because it's still one of the most instantly recognizable studios of all time, because they have been able to stay on screen over the decades mostly through distribution and a smattering of films every year. But for a long time, it's been nothing like what they were during the Golden Age. And of course, in recent years, the Amazon-MGM merger put the studio back on everyone's radar, with a lot of controversy and a lot of back and forth about James Bond. I didn't really cover Bond much in this video because they kind of came in late because of the UA merger, and I do want to do a series of James Bond dedicated retrospectives eventually, let me know if you're interested, and that would cover the history of the franchise actor by actor as a way of breaking up the videos. That's its own strange and convoluted story. It seems like by merging with Amazon, MGM is finally a capable studio once again, but it's not really its own studio anymore. It's Amazon Studios with MGM branding added onto it. And I don't know if that's ever going to change. Seems like unless there's another huge shakeup and another sell-off of MGM, this is where they will stay forever. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the history of MGM, your own personal favorite MGM movies, and any other studios or eras of film that you'd like for me to cover in future videos, because I really do love making these. As always, a huge thank you to my patrons and members for their continued support, and if you'd like to be a member or patron, it's only $2 a month for early access to every video and exclusive reviews, with this month's review being an in-depth look at Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and enjoying some classic cinema.